A lot can happen in a year. Trends, debuts, world-altering events, and pop culture and film is there to reflect it all back to us generations down the line. Welcome to the A Year in Film podcast, presented by Hollywood Suite. I'm your host, Becky Shrimpton, and today I'm joined by film and content specialist Cam Maitland and Kat Ellinger, author, editor, and film critic. The psychedelic movement in cinema theoretically started in the mid to late 60s when LSD and other hallucinogenic drugs became popular among a significant amount of the population. Now, movies with psychedelic imagery gave you a kick in one of two ways. It either tripped you out if you were on a substance, enhancing or triggering a deeper experience, or it gave you the impression you were doing so without the risk of actually taking illicit drugs. Although the movement is attributed to late 60s through the early 70s, there's a number of movies that contain surrealist imagery and experimental narratives that can be included before then, including Un Chien Andalou from the 30s, and some would argue Mary Poppins, which popped up on a whole bunch of lists I was looking at as like an early surrealist psychedelic film. Now, today we're going to look at two movies that fall into that category, but before we do that, Kat, let's talk a bit about some of the better examples of the genre. Like, when is it actually effective filmmaking and when is it just people, jerking off?
I don't know. It's one of those genres, isn't it? It can go either way. It can become the most pretentious, idiotic thing that you've ever seen in your life, or you can just be vibing on it. I don't want to say bad things, though. I don't
that's fair. No, and nor should you.
With Godard in his sort of Maoist, his heavy political phase in the late 60s, and then some of his later work. But I am drawn to really surrealist work, especially like Eastern European. That's one of my specialties. It's obviously Andrzej Jodorowsky, who I've been working on a book on for the last couple of years. A lot of the Czech New Wave. I think that's when it really, really gets it right. Because, you do feel like you're channeling some really like new free movement, this energy. There's a lot of politics in there, and that can be wonderful. But I do think it can get very self-indulgent as well. If you're taking something and filming things, it's not always going to be as amazing as you think it is.
Maybe have a look at Magical Mystery Tour and let's take a bunch of substances, take some cameras out and see what happens, and nothing happens.
I think a good one, you don't have to be on the drugs to enjoy, A bad one, you probably need the drugs.
I have a soft spot for Head. I genuinely like Head. I think it's a lot of fun.
I think Head's been reclaimed. I think it's on the Criterion Collection or something, isn't it?
Is it?
Maybe. I thought it was. I thought somebody had. I don't know. Maybe I'm making it up.
No, that one's fun.
My enjoyment, too, always kind of hinges based on, with the imagery, especially when you're watching stuff from the 60s and 70s, they're not always doing it safely. Unions are not always involved. Yes. And we'll talk a little bit about that in one of our movies today.
Both of them,
Yeah, exactly. So that's, I find myself kind of being removed from the situation, being like, oh, that doesn't look okay. That doesn't look like a safe set or a safe practice. And that always pulls me out a little bit, as opposed to being like, what an incredible image.
Too much of a performer, Becky. You're too. You got to let the film wash over you. Let the magic alter your mind.
I care about other humans. I'm sorry. I will do my best to bring that out. All right. Well, let's get into our first movie today, because I think most people that aren't deep dive midnight movie fans are most familiar with the name Jodorowsky from a documentary made about him, about a movie he never got to make. Now, one of the things you'll glean about him from that documentary is that he is two things: a visionary filmmaker and deeply intense. He's got clear ideas about how he wants things to look and feel, and he will go to any lengths to get the shot he is after. Now, keep that in mind as we venture into one of his most famous films, Holy Mountain. This one actually does have a plot of sorts amidst all the intense imagery. Okay, it's more of a premise than a plot. Now, did this, as Jodorowsky wanted, turn your brain into a flying carpet, or did it pull rusty brains out of your burrows to dimensions you had never imagined? And I quote, Cam, do you have an opinion on either of those?
Yeah. I mean, I think it does. And the interesting thing is, I think I saw this when I was rather young the first time. And of course, it was the craziest thing I'd ever seen. But now that I'm a wizened old sage, I feel like this does have a lot of plot, and it's pretty straightforward. And I kind of have come to be interested in the fact that Jodorowsky, he's kind of a guy who does experimental stuff with a real plot, with a real driving forward narrative. So I think that it's actually a lot more accessible than some psychedelic art things that really don't have that driving narrative in a way. In other ways, the minutia is completely inaccessible because you're like, I can't read Hebrew. But I don't know. He goes both ways. But yeah, basically to just try to get a vague version of the plot out of the way, there's a character called the Thief, sort of a Christ allegory, apparently also an allegory for the Fool and the Tarot. But it starts off a real Christ situation. He's going through kind of a greedy modern world where everything's bad. He eventually finds this crazy tower in which an alchemist lives. That alchemist introduces him to 7 other people based on the planets, and they all go towards this holy mountain in the hopes of finding immortality. And along the way, crazy images, crazy metaphors, all sorts of magic and mysticism from every religion around the world, practically. Yeah, but I also, the other weird thing is I feel like he's a big Buddhist, and because of that, I think that this movie actually has a lot in common with martial arts films. There's a lot of those training and kind of a wise person telling you what you have to do, and then they do it. So I feel like it's quite accessible to just a random person, except for some of the images, which are shocking and unusual. Yeah.
Kat, do you have strong feelings about this one and Jodorowsky in general?
I do. I absolutely love him, and I love surrealism anyway. And it's an interesting one to put in psychedelia because Jodorowsky came from somewhere else. The surrealists were like doing this way before the hippies. They were taking drugs, they were doing like magical ritual and finding themselves in automatic writing. And if you look at Jodorowsky's background in the panic movement, they were like trying to evoke Artaud's theatre of cruelty, which I seem to constantly talk about at the moment. I was doing it recently about Gaspar Noé as well.
Sure.
I bring up Brechtian theater all the time, so I get it. It usually tends to come back to one of the two.
But there's a lot more going on, even though he was using hallucinogenics, but he was kind of using them. But I find him fascinating. He's quote unquote problematic, probably a bit of a dick at this point in his career. Yeah. You get the sense that it's interesting, Cam, you mentioned martial arts, because I've always thought of this as the kind of spiritual version of Game of Death. You know, that Bruce. They all have to go and sort of visit these different masters and stuff. And then he does that in El Topo as well, this like meeting. Yeah. And you just get the sense this is somebody who is desperately trying to find something. And, you know, so it's like the Kabbalah and the Tarot and the Christianity. Yeah. It's like the whole thing. And I just find it fascinating. The fact that he was a dick, even more fascinating. I think he's chilled out over the years. He's become like that guy in the Kung Fu movies who gives the advice now. He's like much more chilled out. And I'm pretty sure he said on one of his commentaries he wouldn't swap himself. Like he was about 70 or so. He's 90 now, isn't he? Yeah. He was like, I wouldn't swap myself now for that guy. So he at least realizes now that he was probably in a very intense place. But it's just great being on that trip. And then just the whole, how they made this thing. It's like, my God. Talk about getting people involved. Take all these mushrooms. It's just madness, isn't it?
Yeah.
You can see why unions did not want to allow this man to have anyone, and they had to go film secretly in the mountains with different performers.
And I mean, I'm fascinated, like you say too. It's. I think we put these both under a banner of psychedelic films simply because it was like we were kind of trying to find movies to match together, and we for a minute we had the two we had Lamora and Messiah of Evil, which were kind of like the weird nightmare, get under your skin ones, and then we had Holy Mountain and a couple other like visually wild, and eventually we're just like, well, both of these movies are kind of like getting in your brain in weird ways. But I like that you also point out, and I think it's in the movie too, like this movie was made somewhat with substances, but then even the movie itself has that point where the guy offers them substances and is made to be a fool.
Yeah, so
like,
the guy with the pills.
What do you believe?
Yeah, because I don't think he was into all of that. He saw it as more as this kind of consciousness expand, like very into the vision quest and stuff like that. But to put that into film, there's so few that do that. Kenneth Anger, maybe, but for Jodorowsky, it's like this weird ritual that he invites you to. And it's nightmarish because like people often think spiritual awakening is people kind of sat around Zen like going, but actually a lot of spiritual awakening is like nightmares. It's like confronting this stuff, like the dark night of the soul. And Holy Mountain definitely ends on that note with people screaming and he was like, they were facing their own death. They were facing.
But the 7 people are also the worst human beings in the world who do recognize they are the worst people in the world and need to come to some sort of enlightenment. So that's good. But it's interesting to me because I think about a filmmaker, and we've talked about him previously on the podcast, which is why I'm going to use him as an example, like Dusan Makaveyev. And I feel like he has a more linear idea to his, I'm going to throw a bunch of imageries at you, but I have one driving point that I'm trying to make. Whereas I feel like Jodorowsky is more like take all of the different things and kind of glean what you can from it. Like if this hits you, that's great. Whereas I feel like there's more of like an intellectual thread to pull with someone like Dusan Makaveyev. Like there's more of that to it and more of an intellectualism. And Jodorowsky, I'm not saying it's not intellectual. I'm just saying it's definitely more image driven and it's more sensation driven than it is a brain engagement.
He actually described himself as having 3 balls to Godard's 1. And it was like, because he was intellectual, whereas Jodorowsky has 3 balls. 1 is spiritual, 1 is sexual, and 1 is intellectual. Yeah. I think he was, like, he described the whole thing in a lot of his films around this time as being some process of ritual for him, for himself. So I don't think he knew what he was doing. I don't think any of them did. They were just dropping the mushrooms because some Zen master told them. Didn't they stay in like a house for about a month? Yeah,
they all stayed in a house.
Having like 4 hours sleep, and then he wasn't allowed to sleep for a week.
What did they do for that month to then come out? It's very and I mean I like, that's the thing too, is I think because I think he especially the religious aspect, there's I think like a parable, he's very into presenting you with a thing and being like, well, like I'm not going to explain it. And that's also, I think, why he likes to pull all the imagery from different cultures, because he knows that like whatever context you're coming to, you may take this in differently. But yeah, I do think that it's also hard to tell what's just nonsense that he had a dream about. And
well, and things just look cool. And he says that film is his medium because film contains everything. It is sound, it is vision, it is I mean, I'm sure at some point he will come out with a 4K movie which will be like smells and water being flicked at you. I'm surprised he didn't. But let's get into the making of this and all of that imagery as well, because that involves the Beatles. Kat, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Well, he tried to get George Harrison involved, and there's this whole scene, I assume this wouldn't be considered a spoiler, where they turn a turd into gold.
Yes.
And there's a quite graphic anus washing shot.
Next to a baby hippo, which is the part that really disturbs me.
And flattering angle. And George Harrison wanted to be in the film. He was like totally into being in the film until he realized he'd have to show his butthole. And then he was like, no. And for some reason, that was a deal breaker to Jodorowsky. It's like, well, if you're not going to show your butthole, you can't be in this film.
See, and that makes me wonder if he learned that lesson going into the Dune thing, because then he was offering those actors anything they wanted. Orson Welles, you want me to bring your favorite chef in from France to cook for you every day? Done. You want to be the most expensive paid actor per minute in the world? Salvador Dali? Done. Yeah. Like, it's interesting that like he started to realize kind of the draw of what those people were to what like to get people to watch it, right? So the origins of the funding for this, because as I'm watching this, did you guys have the same feeling? I mean, this movie is beautiful, but there's so many sets, there's so many actors, there's so much, like there's a huge production value, and I was like, who the fuck paid for this? Who gave this man money?
Yeah.
And And the answer is, in part, John Yoko and one of their producers, Alan Klein, who were multimillionaires. And John and Yoko had seen El Topo, which is his like take on the Western, which is also totally bonkers, at a midnight movie screening. And they kind of got in touch with him and were like, hey, we're interested in funding your next movie because we hear you have trouble finding funding. Yes. I wonder why. So
we hear you're regularly run out of Mexico.
Weird, eh? So they gave him the money to make the movie, and that's when George Harrison got involved. And we've talked before on the show about George Harrison's producing, and it's interesting because, of course, he's known for his like spiritualism and interest especially in like Indian esoteric Hinduism, like that sort of era. So I can see how this would ring bells for him, but I can't help but wonder if he thought this was going to sit kind of along the same lines as Life of Brian, which he also produced.
Yeah, it's interesting. This was like, the end of the 60s or mid-60s. And it's a subject I must be fixated on because I seem to go back to it all the time. But at the end of the 1800s, you had that whole spiritual crisis and fin de siècle and all these occultists that then became surrealist. You had all that, but it was still quite underground. So the 60s was the first time that like occultism and mysticism actually became mainstream. And you had like Crowley on the cover of Sgt. Pepper. And the whole thing, like mysticism, occult, ritual, became a form of rebellion. It was like this kickback against the church and the kind of old ways. So you can totally see why Jodorowsky would be kind of adopted by that movement. Even though he wasn't really a hippie. He was sort of like totally, he's in his own universe. Like he's in his own universe, isn't he? So it's amazing that you can see why, going into a film like that with this kind of master ritual guy and having these experiences would be amazing, even if, it's like get rid of the ego. The whole thing is like get rid of the ego. And it's like, but you won't show your butthole, George. You're not going to fare very well, are you?
Yeah, you're not getting rid of his ego. Yeah, and I mean, all the terrible people they show are weird mixes of essentially like hippies turned capitalists.
Yeah.
Like in a way, it kind of sees where that movement is going. It's all psychedelic weapons and stuff.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. I love one of his old commentaries where he kind of says this predicts this and this predicts that, and I'm very prophetic.
But he's not wrong. Like watching it did feel like something where we're still making commentary about that stuff, but I just felt like I was more actively engaged because it was so whack-doodle.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think he knows that, like, not in a sexual sense, but a certain sensuality of images draws you in, and I think he also it's got a good clip to it, and that's part of what's wild about that. Like that it's a $750,000 budget or whatever, because there's these beautiful sets over and over and over, and a wall of 1,000 testicles, and like it is what it is.
Could you imagine being his PA or one of his like production designers, or I can't even imagine. We're gonna need you nude in this scene. Off you go. But then he's also hanging out with people that are perfectly fine with this. Like one of the most famous scenes of this is the opening scene where he's wearing the Pharrell hat. And it actually is Jodorowsky playing the master in this film, of course. And he's got the two women who he's like ritualistically shaving their head and things. And these women were not paid for their time. They wanted a quote unquote spiritual experience, and therefore they participated. So I'm like, but how do you like? I think I'm curious about the idea of the spiritual experience. Like, do you feel like you have to do something weird? Because some people get it looking at a sunset.
So kind of counterculture, though, wasn't it? They were all doing it. They were all trying to find themselves doing these insane things that.
Yeah. And I mean, I think it's been taken over by tech bros now, right? Like those are the guys now who want the ayahuasca, and it's not gone. It's just I don't know. Now they want to go to space, I guess. That's the new trip.
Cam, it is the final frontier.
So. Yeah,
can we talk about? I don't know why I'd never noticed this before. I actually made a social media post about it earlier, but the fact that Jodorowsky's penis is in every frame of this film. Like, it's literally everywhere. Even the mountain hat man looks like a penis. And I I've had this ongoing fixation with, like, what could you call them? Like occultists or mystics that came out of that generation or just before, like Crowley, LaVey, Kenneth Anger, Alexander, where they took ritual magic as performance and it was all about them, like all about their ego, and I feel that Jodorowsky, and this isn't a criticism, I just find it a weird phenomenon with certain men, how he centers everything about, it's almost as if he's positioned himself as God. At one point, he's like arguing we're all the God, which is very pagan and also very Buddhist. You don't worship the God, you become the God. But it's like, dude, your cock is everywhere in this. Like, everywhere.
But then you have the idea of the ego, right? I mean, we could get very deep into this, but it's like, but then aren't you supposed to be eliminating that? And that's the point of the movie.
And you can't eliminate the ego when it's you going, ha ha, the ego. Like, when the final image is you dancing around about how right you are. It's not quite. I don't know. He's a fascinating guy, and you're right. Like, there's plenty of bad man stuff. You don't want to research his opinions too much, but I
think it's great.
I don't know.
Because you don't get many singular characters like Jodorowsky,
and who stay that way. Really, like he is still a real weirdo.
So I love the idea as well that, like, in the middle of this film, he decided that he understood feminism. So he decided that he wanted
get into that, Becky. So he got the money based on the fact that he was going to do the story of O.
Kind of, but not quite.
Can you imagine? I know they wanted him to do Story of O, but can you imagine Jodorowsky's Story of O?
I mean, part of me is like, I wish you did. Yeah, like that would have been the most sadistic, wild.
Yeah, for people who do not know, the Story of O is kind of considered a female version of like 1,100 Days of Sodom, 100 Days of Sodom. I don't remember. It's one of the two. It's a lot of Sodom. It's not a lot of fun, but it's like this extremely masochistic story about like a woman going through these sexual ordeals, and she's debased on a number of occasions. It's pretty rough and pretty intense, and there's a reason there has not been a film made of it.
No, there's a Yes Jenkins film, which I love actually.
Udo Kier.
Udo Kier's
you might like
in
it, Becky.
In his really hot face. He's like young Udo Kier with the sparkling eyes.
This might be a movie you like, Becky.
I have to tell you. I won't spoil it, but the end pissed me off.
Okay. All right.
But it is a beautiful film. It's totally.
Is it like on a scale of like The Collector? How pissed off am I going to be about
you're going to be
this
fine.
movie?
You're going to be fine.
All right. We'll see. Well, okay. So how this sort of worked in terms of that movie being made was that he was approached by Jodorowsky, surprise, surprise, did not read the ownership right contract when he took the money from Alan Klein. Mm-hmm. So what happened was that he actually owned the rights to both Holy Mountain and El Topo. Now, Alan Klein had already promised a bunch of investors that Jodorowsky was going to make the Story of O. However, Jodorowsky had found feminism while making this and just found the story completely reprehensible and said, I won't do it. And in retaliation, Alan Klein pulled both movies from circulation until the 90s. Yeah. So it was impossible to see either of those movies unless you were at like a very specific screening that was sort of allowed at that point. Now they're pretty ubiquitous and everyone sort of wants to screen them everywhere, but they were completely unavailable for like 30 years, 20 years, 30 years.
I remember as a youth when El Topo came back, when it played at the Metro Cinema in Edmonton. And it was quite something. It was crazy. And it's interesting because I think that kind of, it didn't taint his career, obviously, because he went on to try to do Dune, but I feel like the films after also kind of immediately fell into obscurity and are only now kind of being packaged as an oeuvre.
Because I think the first movie of his I saw was Santa Sangre, and I like that one very much. And that's, I think, a more traditional slasher. Like, it's definitely more, like, he didn't make a mainstream movie, but it's definitely more linear.
I was going to say, like, it's amazing because after Dune, the Dune documentary, not Dune, because we never got that, and I'll be forever sad about that. But
would it have been good, Kat? Do you think it would have been good?
Yeah, I think it would have been the most amazing. I mean, we almost got it with Jodorowsky's Silver Globe, which was like the more nihilistic version, but it would have been totally on those lines, just bigger because Jodorowsky didn't have the funding that Jodorowsky could get. Pink Floyd were going to be in it. Like the whole thing was just, oh, please.
Part of me thinks there's just like it couldn't have existed. Like it was like an art project that needed to fail.
He was working. Big, it must fail.
He was secretly trying to make it fail.
Can you imagine attempting to put Salvador Dali and Orson Welles in the same room? Like I think that's the one where I mean, what a touch. Yeah.
The thing I love too is Dune fans wouldn't like it, right? Like they also wouldn't. Yeah. I don't know. Anyway. Sorry.
But I do think that people like Jodorowsky and also Jodorowsky, Valerian Borowczak, all of those filmmakers which were so kind of obscure for so long are actually more accepted by the quote-unquote midnight movie crowd first. You know, Santa Sangre was, the horror fans are all over Santa Sangre. And then it's like much later on, the kind of serious cinephiles lift up a rock and go, oh yeah, you know, but it's like, you know, there's this like weird kind of, I don't know, no man's land where midnight movie fans tend to pick up this stuff much earlier. Because they just love the whole spectacle of it, even if they don't get it's just the fact that it's so much in your face spectacle.
And there's something about the communal experience of watching that. Like this isn't a psychedelic film, but I remember going to see Mandy together with a bunch it's semi-psychedelic, but going to see that with a bunch of people and all of us just sort of looking at each other throughout the whole film being like, that's happening now. Okay. You know, and there's a pleasure in that sort of communal what the fuckness. It's really enjoyable.
Yeah.
I think that there's something with the midnight crowd too. I see it a lot with, I don't know if it's happening where you are as much, Kat, but a lot of shot on video stuff is kind of the new midnight here. I think that it's just like the midnight crowd is willing to watch a movie that's like, this has a couple things going for it.
Yeah. I think it's much more diverse. We don't tend to have it so much in cinema here, but obviously it's the same people in the home video market. Same people watching weird Jodorowsky bootlegs that were, you know, that are sort of in that same crowd, the midnight movie crowd. But I think there's much more of an open-mindedness there. Whereas, you know, certain serious film scholarship, we're only really now seeing Jodorowsky given serious scholarship, which is crazy, given... Yeah. You know, the whole panic movement thing and the whole political edge of his films. It's like, and he often talks about that himself, you know, it's only now. And a lot of that was to do with Dune. And then suddenly we start seeing all these wonderful restorations. And it's like, yeah, I think it's a wonderful thing, though, because despite all the politics and the spiritual thing, you don't have to be in. The first time I saw Holy Mountain, I wasn't as absorbed in like spiritual things as I am now. Like I specialize in the occult and stuff in my film writing. So I wasn't even looking at it for that. It was because it was weird. It's like, this is weird. I like, just give me this weird. Oh my God. Toad, chameleon, circus. What's going on here?
Yeah.
Why is he eating Jesus' face?
This is the best thing I've ever seen. Why? I don't know. It's just great. And there is like a purity to Jodorowsky, like you said earlier about his, you know, not being so intellectual. There's more of an honesty to it, I think, because they did honestly believe they were like taking some kind of spiritual trip, like as a collective. And the other people would be drawn into that. It's like almost like a childish honesty to it, which I appreciate.
Totally. I think that I wrote down that I think that something that gives the film appeal is its lack of subtlety. Because I feel like sometimes when I'm engaging with a similar work that's trying to be religious and maybe engage with politics, I really have to understand where it's coming from.
Yeah.
Whereas this one, it's just out there, you know, it's just trying to throw it all.
Yeah, it's like sometimes you can feel like you're being lectured to or talked down to, or something's just being weird for the sake of it to kind of obscure things so that only certain people can get it and you need to get it. Like that whole thing, I'm really not into that. Whereas Jodorowsky is like a child, this strange experiment. Like, I mean, he is pooing in his own hand and smearing it sometimes. But, you know, there's a joy in that too. There's a joy in that too. And there's a lot of humour in the film as well. Even though it is kind of like theatre of cruelty in this, like, barrage, which he really believed in. It's like, Jodorowsky was like Auteur. Auteur was like, the surrealists don't go far enough. I'm going to start this theatre where,
we're really going to have people up.
Middle being assaulted. And he kind of does the same thing, but there's also like really funny moments in it as well that just remind you that he's human.
I think the most important thing is that this is extremely competently made. Like, it's beautiful to look at. At any point of this, you could take a still frame from this and be like, that's a painting. Like, the table that's the eyeball is like, how does your brain work that way to both have this symbolism and have it be a gorgeous shot?
And I mean, like you're saying, it's also wild to think that this maniac who's doing all this theater stuff with his actors is also, he has a crew that seems to be like a tight professional movie crew that is just shooting perfectly. Like, it's not a roughshod film. This looks like it's Vincent Minnelli or something.
I think he was just making up as he went along as well. There was that kind of what looks like a crane shot in El Topo, and he said, I read, I don't know, it was one of his interviews or his old commentaries where he's going on about how Sergio Leone, we went to dinner with him, he's like, how do you do this and how do you... He's like, I just got a stack of chairs. There's like no safety in mind at all. There's that, not to go into another film, but there's a whole scene in El Topo where they're on this bridge that is about to collapse, and he's like climbing on the side of it, and like you're just like, oh my god, get down off there, please. No.
He didn't have a permit to land the helicopter in a public street, and he went, we're gonna do it anyway because I need the shot.
This is why you need to be a weird messianic figure, because you can convince anyone of anything, no problem.
Oh man. All right, well, I'm gonna bring us into our next film, which perhaps is not as critically acclaimed, but boy, is it full of some whacked out imagery. That's going to be Messiah of Evil, coming up after the break. Provocative imagery is especially effective in horror. I still get chills when I think about Twin Peaks' Bob in nightmarish slow motion climbing over the couch to get Maddie Ferguson. As someone who finds movie theaters her happy place, there is one particular scene in our next movie, Messiah of Evil, that I find particularly skin-crawling as that theater becomes progressively less safe, as does a supermarket and a whole beachside town. Let's get into this one before I give too much away. Kat, you can go ahead and give it away.
Oh, wow. Well, a lot easier to surmise than the Holy Mountain. I mean, Messiah of Evil is just pure American Gothic. You've got this young woman named Arletty, who's played by Mariana Hill, and her father's missing. He's like an artist, and she goes off to this coastal town. And I always, anything nautical, and I'm there. Just called Point Doom. And she finds a really strange insular community there. Like her father's missing. She finds his diaries, and he starts talking about these strange incidences around the town. And it turns out that the town is going through this strange sort of curse. It's very Lovecraftian. It's kind of like a zombie film, but not. And Arletty meets this like strange group, talking to hippies. This strange group. There's Tom, played by Michael Greer, and these two women who are all over him all the time. Tony, played by Joy Bang, and Laura. I know, because he's just and Laura, played by Anitra Ford. So she hooks up with them, and they start investigating this town, and it just becomes weirder and weirder and weirder. I mean, this film just occupies, for an American film, I think we talked about this when we did Let's Scare Jessica to Death. It's this weird, like there's this weird subset of American films that come out around this time. Let's Scare Jessica to Death, Carnival of Souls, Messiah of Evil, that seem to exist in a universe completely of their own. The vibe, the feel of them, you could say it's a zombie film, but it's kind of, but not really. It's
more of like a soulless human film. Like, they're less zombie than they are like devoid of soul.
Yeah, it's just like unlike anything else, and just occupies this really strange energy. And I love the fact that since it got a Blu-ray, more and more people have been discovering it. And they're just like, where has this film been all my life? Oh, my God. Like, why haven't I seen this before?
What's
is incredible.
bonkers is the amount of incredibly, like, people we now know as, like, huge directors. Like, Tim Burton is a huge fan of this movie. And when he was working with his editor and his cinematographer, I believe it was his editor who had worked on this this one. And he was like, my first movie was this movie you probably never heard of called Messiah of Evil. And he's like, I've seen it. I loved it. I watched it in a drive-through like 6 times. And this was like in like the 90s, right? So it wouldn't have had that release at that point, which is interesting that it even had then kind of clicked into people who knew what they were looking at.
I think that this kind of film that you talk about has increasingly, it's kind of being, like you said, the midnight crowd is now it's come into the art crowd who's sort of forming this oeuvre. I love it. It's the weird, kind of takes the European feel and puts it in America, and it has this tone. Like, I like these movies where it almost seems like you're like, is this acting bad? But then everyone's acting the same way, and you're like, no,
it's like they're on drugs,
choice.
Isn't it? It's like there's something not like a strange disconnect. Everyone's kind of, and you only see it in those American underground films. Yeah. It's similar in Jessica. Everyone is kind of on edge, and I don't think it's bad acting at all.
No.
It's something else that's going on.
It's because it also ends up being extremely disturbing in a way. And then you find out that all the zombies are aerospace employees who are out of work. They just got everybody from the job line. I had
to look up what happened with the aerospace layoffs, and this happened in like 1970, 1971. And basically, after we landed on the moon, I say that as a collective humanity. After NASA landed on the moon, they started cutting because there was such a big depression. They started cutting stuff because they're like, well, we made it there. We don't really need anything else. And so all of those programs got cut, and there's this bonkers ad in the New York Times where they're lamenting the massive cuts made to the Werner von Braun section of it, where they're just like, wow, our Germans, they refer to them as in the New York Times. So it is it's an interesting little article being like, these are our heroes and we let them go, we let them down.
Weird. Yeah, it's also fascinating. I will say that we've talked actually a lot about this movie because we've talked a lot about the filmmakers behind it, because they just keep coming up for some reason on our podcast. And I was fascinated. I've never dug too deep into it. It's just a movie I liked and enjoyed. And I've always considered for Willard, Huyck, and Gloria Katz that this is what they could have been doing this whole time. But then to find out they hate it and they've essentially disowned it. It's sad.
It is pretty sad because it is an actual masterpiece, and that's not just hyperbole. It's such a special film, and it's a shame they don't love it and cherish it as much as it's become loved and cherished, like especially in the last decade or so.
Do they speak fondly of any of their work, though?
Maybe not. I don't know. Temple of Doom, maybe. I think that they like what they added to Star Wars, from what I could see.
Yeah, because Gloria Katz rewrote Princess Leia for people who do not know.
I think that I don't know. It's weird because looking at their whole filmography,
they did Howard the Duck, mind blows. Yes. That's almost unforgivable.
I will say, because we've gotten unfortunately deep in Howard the Duck, their original concept was animated and psychedelic, I believe. So I don't think that they even got to really get their Howard to the screen. So I think it's people who are beaten down by quite often not being able to get the movies they wanted to make made. But it's very unfortunate. And I think of something like, I heard them complain about the soundtrack, and I wrote this whole thing where I'm trying to research this electronic musician, Fillion Bishop.
It's amazing, isn't it?
It's amazing.
It is so amazing, the soundtrack. And so, this was 73. By the early 80s, that kind of soundtrack was this
absolutely
predominant thing. But this is 73, where electronic music is quite new and experimental, and it's so good. Everything about it.
Yeah. And that's it's a thing that was added by the company that took it away from them. But it's maybe that company knew what they were doing.
Well, and then I'm kind of fascinated by this whole process in general, because I'm is this just the case of like incompetence producing gold, because you see a whole bunch of people like they were fresh out of film school. This was their first feature that they were given the chance to co-direct. Of course, Gloria Katz doesn't get the co-directing credit, but she did. They co-wrote it together as the writing team that they are. And they took this as the handoff because they're like, this is how everybody was getting in. Everybody did a bad horror movie, and then the studios called you and gave you like $1 million to make the movie you really wanted to make. That's how it was working in the early 70s. But you have people like Jack Fisk, who is the editor. You've got this incredible cinematographer who's doing a bunch of stuff, and everybody seems to be doing their own thing. And those people turned out to be very good at what they did. Yeah. But it seems like the overall direction, which was provided by Willard, Huyck, and Gloria Katz, is the part that's kind of disparate and why it was taken away from them. Because the stuff they wanted to do, when you hear about what they wanted to keep moving with, like the ending that tied everything together, like this movie is so much better ambiguous. Yeah. I don't want to know anything about the Dark Stranger. So it's like, is this just the fact that like they just luck into how good this actually is?
It is one of the like Lovecraft has been notoriously difficult to film.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I always feel like the best Lovecraftian films are not Lovecraft films. So like The Thing. Yeah. And this is like the closest you actually get to that uncanny sense of terror in Lovecraft without being Lovecraft. And I know they talked about being fans of Lovecraft. They really get that Lovecraftian, like that fear of the other, the fear of the outsider, the whole small town thing, and this idea of contagion. And, you know, it's just so unsettling, but they seem to get that really instinctively.
And that's also a thing that I was fascinated by, because I thought like, oh, this is fully like put together like a Lovecraft story. But they say that a lot of that voiceover, which is so Lovecraft, like somebody speaking from the future about a horrible event that's happened, they say that a lot of that was thrown on because they didn't get their ending.
Warrentoon doesn't look any different than 1,000 other neon stucco towns. But what happened there, what they did to me, what they're doing now, they're coming here.
But it's like, but you just made it more Lovecraft. Like, you created this weird horror moment.
The whole idea of the diary and finding the dad's diary and that whole like tracking back and what happened and these things unfolding and something from 100 years ago sort of resurfacing as this threat is so pure Lovecraft. And American Gothic's one of my favorite things ever, but we don't see enough of it in cinema. Like they talked about in one of the interviews they did how they were looking at the Universal classics. No Universal film is like Messiah of Evil.
No.
So what are you talking about? But Universal had this tendency to focus on European Gothic, and American Gothic is often far more perverse. You've always got this obsession with mania, with madness, with this paranoia of like the savage coming in, this weird American thing of like the outsiders are coming, they're going to get us, and paranoia and all of this thing. And it happened so rarely in cinema. I know Poe was like difficult to adapt, and Roger Corman did his own thing with that, but made them more like European films. Yeah. And, you know, and Lovecraft is really difficult to adapt. But they really nail it in a way, you know, the whole coastal thing, which you then later see in The Fog, John Carpenter's The Fog, which is another great American Gothic. So it's like more of this. And it's like you guys are just like made this masterpiece of like before, I'm pretty sure before Salem's Lot as well. So you've got the idea of the town being corrupted, which was like the big thing in King's Salem's Lot. I can't remember what year that came out. But I think pretty sure it was after this idea of like everybody being corrupted by some nefarious force, and it's like they don't seem to have any idea what they've done,
what they made. But then you hear about the cinematography, and one of the reasons this looks so different is the cinematographer was getting pushback from a lot of the producers being like, this is eventually going to air on TV because that's how we're going to sell it, so make sure like, you know, you're fitting the images to this tiny little box. And he was like, no, I want this to be cinematic. I want this to be a movie, which is why you have those big sweeping vistas, why you have like these wide shots of even like one of my favorites is at the gas station, the first time you see the guy standing there in that gorgeously framed shot where he's right in the middle, and you're like, oh, this is creepy and weird. Or like even like the gas station attendant shooting off into the dark at something that you don't even know what it is, but the way they framed it, you're like, that's, and then he's like, can I fill it up for you? You know, like, what were you just shooting at just for fun? It's very cool.
Again, this is the first year I watched the film Lamora, which has weirdly some similar. They also have the beast people just in the dark that are kind of thrown out there, and you're like, yeah, what was connecting? But I think you're right that the Poe and the Lovecraft thing is also because, you know, those are mostly poems and short stories, so they're kind of sketchy in their way, and I think people are so afraid to let a film be sort of sketchy and loose, and I guess maybe you need a messy situation to produce that. I don't know.
I do feel with Lovecraft, people tend to overload with effects. They try and go for more effects-driven stuff. And obviously in the early 70s, the technology just wasn't there. Like, you could do Lovecraft easily now with all the CGI and everything, but the ones that really work are the ones that just focus on that absolute, like, I remember reading Mountains of Madness when I was a teen, and that severely traumatized me. Like, and it wasn't necessarily the blind 6-foot penguins, although that haunted me for a long time. It was this overriding feeling of just, like this horrible feeling that you get. And the ones that are more effective capture that feeling. Messiah of Evil does that, like, in really simple terms. Like, there's the scene in the cinema is flat out one of my favorite scenes in all of 70s horror, and it's so simple. Like you said, aerospace workers, and they're not even actors, but it is chilling. It's just really absolutely disturbing.
Well, because it's taking that idea of like, because everything seems safe and there's nothing unusual about, especially in the 70s, of people coming into a theater, you know, a little bit late and then sitting down. But it's the moment, and it's so beautifully acted. It's the moment when she realizes she's surrounded. That's when it's like, oh shit. And you have that beautiful dramatic irony for us because we see all of these people coming in and she doesn't know she's fucked yet. And yet they keep cutting to the Western film Gone with the West, which I'm like, this movie came out the year before. How did they get the footage rights for that to play in this movie? I'm fascinated.
They knew
by
the
that.
right guy.
They must have.
I'm interested too because Stephen Katz, the cinematographer, who we should say is Gloria Katz's brother, which is also interesting. She just got her brother to do it, who went on to be John Landis's cinematographer.
Hey.
But he said that he also wanted it to be like brightly lit, which I think adds to that safety. Like that feeling that you're in a normal world. I also think that there's something incredibly disturbing to me that the outside world seems to know what's happening. This is not one of those insular towns where something's going wrong, but it's like you can't leave. This one is like everybody tells them not to go to this town. There are kind of cops from outside saying, hey, you should probably leave. Nothing good comes from this. And then the two cops that show up to shoot at zombies and just get completely fucked is so weird. Yeah, it's just an upsetting film in a lot of ways that it's hard to put your finger on. And that's I guess the psychedelic idea, the way that it's crawling in your head in kind of inexplicable ways.
The supermarket scene as well.
Yeah.
Is
slurping
really
on the meat.
Yeah.
The sound whenever they have a lot, and the supermarket a lot, there is no music, too. I think sometimes they pull away the music. Same with the opening. It's just breathing and footsteps and murder, and it makes you so tense.
I don't care for it. Well, it's, I mean, like, it's one of the, we talked about it earlier, how, like, the acting level is like, is this good acting or is this just, you know, what is it? But I want to bring us into Michael Greer because he was someone who had a really interesting career. And I think he's so good in this, seeing as, like, he has this, like, almost like a sexual ambiguity to him, which I think is really effective. Of like, is he actually interested in sleeping with all these women, or is there something off and weird about him as well? Because he's got like almost an asexuality to him in this film. It's a really interesting choice.
You don't understand why those women are all over him.
Yeah,
and it immediately sets him up as kind of sinister. It's a great performance because you can't figure him out, and
And I don't want to know more about him. That's the big thing. So I'm like, do not explain anything about this man.
Yeah. It reminded me, just to bring it to another podcast when we talked about Rupert Everett and Cemetery Man, the kind of like iconic gay person playing very straight, swarthy, has that weird feel where you're like, I get it, but I don't. Yeah. And yeah, so Michael Greer is like a famous drag performer discovered by Judy Garland. He apparently dubbed Bette Davis in a few of her final performances, which I love. And it interestingly, I'm super into like Canadian queer cinema, and he's in the version of Fortune in Men's Eyes that's kind of gotten a little lost with Sal Mineo, but he started that role on Broadway, and so he's a very interesting guy to see in this, because I only know him from like The Gay Deceivers, where he's like a very queenie, sort of swishy, but at the same time was very groundbreaking. He was a gay actor who was willing to play gay, and so very interesting to see him, I think, convincingly play a straight weirdo.
Yeah,
here.
like the kind of Lothario, but not quite. You get the sense he's like some sort of cult leader, maybe, or there's just
because he's clearly preying on vulnerability, like both those. And then when the one woman is like, "Oh, I see what this is,"
to the women.
Yeah,
I mean, they talk about drugs, and so I want, like, it's like, is he a drug dealer? I mean, when you meet him, he's got a hobo in his room that he's just getting to tell him stories, which is the weirdest thing on earth.
I remember the red moon my daddy told me about, only once. Mama gave him a bad look when he talked about it. He was only a boy himself then. He called it the blood moon. He said that was the night that he lost religion.
That hobo is amazing, though.
Amazing. and I believe another, like, fairly classic actor, too. Like, the other thing is, of course, when you're making films for cheap in Hollywood in this era, you're getting guys who are, like, he's from The House on Haunted Hill, that hobo, which is wild. I don't know what he plays, but he's in it. He's in The Maltese Falcon, apparently. A fascinating Alicia Cook Jr. is his name. But yeah, that speech, they wanted to feed me to the chickens, but my mother said, or my father said, we could use a boy. So weird.
This crosses sort of a boundary because, of course, as we mentioned, this is the time where like they were just churning out as many horror movies as possible to get into the drive-ins, to put them on TV for that kind of that kind of just quick, easy buck and repeatability. And this one feels like there was an attempt to make it better, like taking that, like we're gonna make this our calling card and elevate it, looking at, like, you know, French and Italian cinema. There's clear Antonioni influences in here, but I love the fact that the producers wanted to call this Return of the Living Dead, which of course you would get later in 1985. We'll be talking about it later, but it's such an interesting way to capitalize on a franchise that is murky in its legal ownership. We're going to get into this into a later episode, but this is the one time they were really able to kind of combat the usage of the name of the Living Dead. It's really interesting to me because it's also, these aren't living dead people. Like, that's not really what this is.
Yeah, that whole post-Romero thing, though, really sparked, especially in the early 70s, some really amazing, really experimental quote-unquote zombie cinema, like the Tombs of the Blind Dead, Jorge Grau's Manchester Morgue, Living Dead at the Manchester Morgue as well. And people just, it was almost as if, because Romero did so well, people using that as a sell, like, oh, I'll do you a script on this, but then just doing whatever the hell they wanted, not actually doing that. Death Dream's another really interesting one in that era, which I think came out the same year as this, actually.
Yeah,
I always call them Nightmare USA films, because Stephen Thrower put them all together in that amazing book, was like made them a kind of little genre, I guess, of their own. But Death Dream by Bob Clark. Another one, it's just such a weird film. Like, you just get this feeling like that really bad's gonna happen.
There's someone with an eclectic resume that I'm sure we'll have to cover eventually.
It's like, to me, it's like upsetting films too. Like films that, and it's not that anything more, like I would say that more upsetting things happen in Holy Mountain, but something about when you leave the movie, you're like, ugh. The world is evil. You know, like there is a dark rot inside. Yeah, and I mean, just images. I mean, this is just my gender studies coming through. But when she's stabbing her inner thigh, which is like a weird. There's like menstrual rituals that are like that, and that's such a disturbing image.
But it does the whole gothic gaslighting thing, which we talked about when we did Let's Scare Jessica to Death as well. This idea of women on the brink of madness, which I feel was a big thing in the early 70s. It just seemed to be everywhere, didn't it?
Well, it's also preying into the feminist aspect, right? Of like, we think women are crazy, they're overreacting about everything. You know, it's that when they make those insinuations, the art curator at the beginning is, number one, your dad's a crappy artist, and number two, all he does is bring women up to his apartment to bang them to his daughter. Like it's very interesting. Like even from the very beginning, everyone is treating her like she's not well in the head.
Yeah.
Joseph Lang? Do I know who he is? We do get magazines in Point Dume, which some of us can even read.
Which I really like that, and I like the fact that they left it ambiguous, but just the screaming and everything. I just
She's such what a good screamer too. My God, I felt bad because I was watching it in the morning, and I'm like, if people upstairs are hearing these screams,
you know what? You get to be somebody's story. That makes somebody's day better, I'm sure, when they get to tell a story about their weird housemates, I guess. Yeah. All right. Anything else we want to talk about on this one?
Oh, the not happy ending.
Yes, please. Let's bring up the ending, because it is not happy. But like, how many horror movies of this time, like, did horror movies have to have a happy resolution?
No, I feel like this was the major shift. I think post like Rosemary's Baby and Night of the Living Dead was, if you look at the more kind of gothic-y stuff from earlier on, it's very clear cut, good versus evil. Dracula gets defeated by the end, you know. Whereas by the late 60s, early 70s, you end up with this, especially the more independent stuff, Texas Chainsaw Massacre. You know, it's basically things that will just leave you devastated, because it's just like such a cynical... It's amazing, and it's obviously to do with the climate, because the early 70s was a really cynical climate, like politically, culturally, everyone was... You know, especially post Manson, everyone had their minds blown, and you just get this change. And for America, I always associate, like, no offense to Americans, but but you know, that Hollywood thing with the kind of very clear good versus evil. We've seen that come back with the superhero film. Like, people like these nice clean narratives, and just for that little while in genre cinema, Let's Scare Jessica to Death, Messiah of Evil. You know, these things that leave you with, you know, by the time you get to the end, it's like, this is it. You know, everybody's dead. You're all going to die. Yeah. And anyone survives, they're just going to think you're mad, stick you in this thing. Yeah. and it's like, and like Texas Chainsaw, you know, with the whole ending in that, this whole thing, oh yeah, look at this. No, sorry. And you know,
you think she's fine. She's not fine. She's never been fine. She'll never be fine.
Yeah, that last shot of Texas Chainsaw with the kind of hysterical laughing, I feel just sums up that whole era. And Messiah of Evil does that well.
Because the tagline for that is what will be left of them is the last bit, right? Who will survive and what will be left of them. And I love that idea of like, she kept all her limbs, but her brain is gone, right?
Yeah.
Like she's completely destroyed. It's such an interesting point, Kat.
Yeah, I mean the ending when they kind of swim away and then he just drifts off. Screaming. And then she's sort of stuck in this hospital with everyone treating her like she's nuts. It's awful, but it's amazing at the same time. It is amazing. It seems much more in line with European stuff, weirdly.
They shit talk all these horror things, but then they say that they love Italian films and French films, and it's like, in your own way, you kind of accidentally made an Italian horror movie. You did make a modern horror movie.
Yeah, because this kind of weirdly foreshadows like Fulci zombie flesh eaters. With the dad and the daughter going to look for the dad in the diaries, and you know. It's totally got a European vibe. A lot of those films have. It's like, I don't know if it's just because filmmakers were just suddenly watching more Europeans because the 60s got flooded with it. And then they just started taking that over into their own film, maybe subconsciously just thinking, hey, I want to do this a different way. But it totally feels more in line with the Eurocult stuff, which is always much more surreal. It always had like horrible endings or nihilistic endings. And it's almost as if it carried over just for a little while. And then we get to the slasher and it's that good versus evil was back. I mean, I love the slasher, but it is very, confront the beast, survive at the end, the hero, the final girl. Whereas in the 70s, if you got out, you were going to be left screaming and hysterical on the back of some truck.
All right, I think that is exactly where we need to leave this episode. So Cameron Maitland, thank you once again for joining us.
Thank you, and I will say that if you like the Fillion Bishop soundtrack, he only did 2 more movies, but they're The Severed Arm and Kiss of the Tarantula, which both seem pretty fun.
Kiss the Tarantula. Ooh, I'm in. That sounds
evil kid who kills people with spiders.
Really?
That's
That's fantastic. Oh, man, I love it. Kat Ellinger, thank you so much for joining us once again. It's always a pleasure to have you.
This was fun.
We greatly enjoyed your performance on Woodlands Dark and Days Bewitched. Fantastic talking head action there.
Yes. I was on as the resident witch, so.
Yeah. We love it.
Is there anything else you want to point people towards?
Well, talking of Theatre of Cruelty, I just did a commentary track on Gaspar Noé's Lux Eterna for talking about trippy, over-the-top, extrasensory cinema. I think that is the kind of natural successor in a way. So check that out. It's coming out from Arrow very soon, I believe.
Thank you once again, Kat. And you can join us next time, where we're going to be joined by Hollywood Suite's own Lacey Novinka, and we'll look at 2 women-directed films. It's Stephanie Rothschild's Group Marriage and Lena Wertmüller's Love and Anarchy. That's coming up in 2 weeks. Thanks for joining us for this episode of the A Year in Film podcast from Hollywood Suite. If you enjoyed the show, please remember to rate and review us on your podcast platform. Find us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, at Hollywood Suite. Hollywood Suite is the home of the movies and the series that shaped the 70s, 80s, 90s, and 2000s. Always uncut and always commercial-free. Hollywood Suite lets you experience movies the way they were meant to be seen. On 4 HD channels and Hollywood Suite On Demand. Subscribe today at hollywoodsuite.ca. The A Year in Film podcast is hosted by Becky Shrimpton and produced by Becky Shrimpton, Alicia Fletcher, and Cameron Maitland. And today featured Cam Maitland and Kat Ellinger as guests. Supervising producer is Emily Gagne. Executive producers are David Kynes and Julie Kumaria. Audio engineering by Andy Reid. We'll see you in a couple weeks.